Hello, and thank you for joining us. And certainly thank you to Smiles for Speech for having me. I am Dejunne Clark Jackson, and I will be presenting on dyslexia, the early indicators and characteristics. So, a lot of what we're going to see and talk about was adapted from the California Dyslexia Guidelines resource. And it is an amazing resource to just sift through the researchy stuff and get down to the heart of what we see in dyslexia and how we can move forward with trying to remediate it. So let's see. The first thing I want to talk about is, and make known, is that dyslexia is on a continuum. And by continuum, I mean that dyslexia, what we think of as a spectrum, meaning it runs from one end to the other. They can look very differently. So on one side, we have that dyslexia can be mild, meaning students or people or kids may have limited or just a few of all the things that we talk about as early indicators and characteristics. But then you can have the very severe side where that person would have all the things, most of the things that would be considered signs and characteristics and symptoms. And I say that, and it's important to understand that because the things that we're going to discuss, it's not all inclusive, and it doesn't mean that someone who has dyslexia should meet all of these markers. Because again, we're talking about mild end to severe end. So they can be very different, but still both are dealing with the same concerns. So when we look at common symptoms, we're going to talk about that in a broader sense, and in terms of what a student with dyslexia or a person with dyslexia would come and have some general struggles with. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the inability to sound out new words. And what I mean by that, and what we call, is decoding. So if you see a word and you take it sound by sound, breaking that word apart, but you're really and truly struggling or even have the inability to do that, to even have the mechanics of doing that because you can't connect the sound to print, that's what we would think of as an overarching common symptom. Another one is going to be sight words. So when we teach sight words, and that already makes me cringe, when we teach sight words, we think in terms of, here is a word that should be, I'm going to say, memorized or noticed or observed by sight, meaning I see it, I automatically know what it is. Automaticity is what we call that. But if you have the limited ability to do that, to have that sight word sort of built up in your vocabulary, it's harder to retrieve that when you see it because you did not set that in memory to begin with. The next thing is listening comprehension. And this one actually talks about two different things, listening and reading. So when we think in terms of comprehension, we think in terms of being able to understand what is said or understand what is read. So when we think of listening comprehension, if you and another person are speaking the same language, you would expect that they are understanding what you're saying. And if you are reading text, you would assume that you understood what you read. But here's where the difference comes in for a lot of dyslexics, is that their listening comprehension, my ability to hear what you say, understand what is said, that is far exceeds my ability to read a book and understand what I read after I'm done. Because there's a whole lot of things going on in that reading process, which we'll get to. And then finally is the inadequate response to instruction. And it's in there about effective instruction. Because we know lots of times students aren't being taught to read how their brain learns how to read. So that's why it's important to say they inadequately respond, or they, even though students have had reading instruction that is the proper reading instruction, they still aren't able to read, or do the components of all the components of reading, then we know that that is a common symptom. So now let's look at the signs of dyslexia. So remember, symptoms was the big overarching thing. So let's take a look at those the sort of road signs as we travel. And I always have to say, keep in mind that they can run between mild and severe. So, and you're moderate, in between. So keep that in mind when looking through these lists. So let's look at preschool age, and we're going to take a journey sort of through the years. And for us, preschool is about 3 or 4 years old. So some of the things that you would see, and I'm not going to read this list exhaustively, but we're going to sort of highlight some of the things that are on here. The big thing that we find that's a trend that researchers have found that's a trend is the connection between dyslexia and being a late talker. That doesn't mean that every kid that talks beyond the recommended age that they should be speaking so many words, we are automatically going to say that's dyslexia. Again, that's based on the research and the characteristics of those who have the diagnosis. This is what they tend to see. So late talking and difficulty in speech. And we know that we're speaking for the speech community now, with the speech community now, that there could be other reasons that you have speech difficulties that are not in alignment with dyslexia. So we, again, keep that in mind. I will always tend to sort of use disclaimers throughout this because nothing is hard and fast, and we have to remember it runs on a continuum. Name. So we know that we love to teach our kids how to recognize their name and spell their name. They love to see their names in print. And, when you go to the store and you find that Rolodex of names and they can pick theirs out. Well, if your preschooler, 3 or 4 year old, is still struggling to identify their name, not spell it, not write it, but if they can't recognize that, yes, that's my name, then that's an early indicator. Another one that I commonly use, a lot of people commonly use, is nursery rhymes. Because again, we're talking about emerging learners. We love to do nursery rhymes, and we love to create these rhymes and have, kids find the rhyming word. And that's a little later in development. But if they have difficulty even hearing the rhyming patterns in those nursery rhymes, then that's something that we struggle with. One thing that we think in terms of what kids should know in the preschool era is their alphabets, right? Saying the alphabet in order and seeing it in order. So struggling to remember the alphabets or recognize the alphabets is a challenge for students with dyslexia. And then I would probably pick out the last one would be some difficulty separating sounds and words. And this one, even though it's on the preschool side, they should definitely be developing that at around 4, but that's not something that should be mastered, but sort of starting to see that evolve. And we want to keep an eye on that. The next area is kindergarten. So that's ages 5 to 7 for us. One thing that kindergartners do that is so cute and so fun is mispronouncing words. And that's in preschool too. We love when our kids say things that just melt our hearts, and we don't want them to ever change, and we want them to pronounce pescetti instead of spaghetti, or with instead of with. But then as they sort of evolve, we want to make sure that the cuteness of that evolves into they actually know the difference in those sounds. That spaghetti starts with the s sound, and that with has th at the end, and my teeth and my tongue it's a completely different placement than with. So those are some things that we want to look for. And if they're still mispronouncing those words and they don't understand the connection between those, that sound and the placement and position of their tongue, teeth, and lips, and then we make sure that we watch that. So kindergartners are starting to read, right? It's exciting. They have get to hold books and look through books. One thing that we like to do is have them track while we read, like follow along as I read on the page. If they're having difficulty tracking from left to right, that can be an indicator, an early sign and indicator that we need to look further. I'll say one more about the kindergarten, because kindergarten and pre-K kind of mesh together, because we're talking about these emerging readers, sound, individual sound words, and then we're sort of blending those already in kindergarten, and we should read whole words in first. But if your emerging reader is heavily relying on pictures to determine what the words say, that is not only problematic in teaching kids to read. It's great with inference and how does the illustrator show us what the words say, but in terms of reading the words, we don't want them guessing the word based on the picture that they see. We want them to actually connect those sight and sound. Second to third graders, so these are my readers, but if they don't want to read and they avoid reading, then those are some early signs of dyslexia, especially when you hear the reading and they are mispronouncing or omitting parts of the words, guessing at words, replacing it for something that sounds similar. Those are some things that we look for in terms of red flags. One thing that I like to say is that dyslexia is not just about reading. Always push for that. And some of the non-reading tasks that we see emerging is the trouble recalling, pulling words of things that they already know. So there's a book, there's a chair, there's a pencil, there's the house, that's the dog. But if they're saying this, that, it, and they're not attaching that that noun to it, then we know, or the thing, we know that that's something that we would call word retrieval difficulty. Confusion over what the word sounds like, even when you're speaking and not necessarily reading. And that difficulty learning the connection between the sounds and what they see in print. And of course, that all goes to the mispronunciation of the words that they are speaking or reading. So let's look at our 9 to 14-year-olds. That's our 4th through 8th graders for us. These students, for red flags, would have a history, right? Because we just went through 4 years prior to 6 years prior of all the things that they struggled with along the way. There's a history there. So we always want to sort of look at the historical progress and performance of students to determine how long has this been going on. Consistent patterns in reading errors. Remember, we talked about having students repeat those same reading errors, sound errors, guessing, those sort of repetitive patterns of reading challenges. Another one is, because this is an older group, so we are talking about word structure. We're talking about word origin, like where does a word come from? What makes up this part of the word? How do I know to say this sound instead of that sound in this word? There is a lack of understanding and awareness of the structure of the word and the knowledge of sort of where those word parts come from. If we go back a couple, we would say, like when we do compound words, compound word is made up of 2 words, and you can know what parts of the words are and, segmenting and blending. But if we don't know how to chunk a word or how to separate the parts of the word, that awareness at 9 and 14 is a concern. Lack of fluency when reading. Like, what is fluency? Fluency is not only just the automation of your reading, it is also the intonation, how, my pitch and sound, And it's also the flow, like your words, you're flowing with the author's intention in reading. So, and your errors are low. That's what we call, fluency in reading. But if they're reading and they're reading aloud to you and it sounds choppy and they're constantly trying to read sounds instead of words, that's something that we would be concerned about. And then because they're reading sound by sound, at the end of the story or the book, to comprehend what they just read is almost impossible because I was so focused on reading the sounds to make the word. By the time I got to the end of the story, I've forgotten the previous words because they had no meaning. They were just sounds. So that's a red flag. And then this group is going to start to read or learn rather foreign languages. English was hard enough. So if they are going to learn, and even if it's a different language, if they're going to learn a language other than what their print language will be, then that's going to be difficult. And of course, the organizing and writing of stories, sentences, knowing the structure, because there's an organizational component that is really difficult for students with dyslexia to truly get a handle on. All right, so we know that dyslexia does not go away. We know that if students with dyslexia are remediated early on, then the likelihood of success in high school and college is far greater. But we have high school and college students, 15 or older, that are you're going to see these struggles. And beginning with the history, they're going to have a history of struggle. Tendency to read with great effort and a slow pace. It's taking everything out of them to read, and then they're struggling. So it's a slower pace. And then, of course, we're avoiding altogether. We're just not going to read. I'll just pass that right on up. Those are some of the behavior consequences that we see in students who struggle with dyslexia. And then that word retrieval, extreme fatigue. Like, have you ever worked out and been super tired? Students with dyslexia, their brains, their body, physically, they are trying to exhaust every effort to do what their counterparts are doing seamlessly. So, of course, that brings on behavior and social, struggles, because avoidance probably looks like acting out and not being able to understand what the conversation is that you and your friends are having. It can lead to your friends feeling a certain kind of way. So this social emotional development around this age and then the previous slide is really something that we need to look at as early indicators. So if you have a student that is acting out and misbehaving, we always want to get to the root of it. I'm a counselor by training, one of my other trainings. And so there's some things that you want to not just slap a label on or a cause or a reason. We always have surface issues that have layers and layers and layers of reasons. But I won't tell you all the challenges of a student with dyslexia without telling you all of the strengths. Because in spite of all that students struggle through, they are immensely creative and curious and imaginative and experimental. They are not, and creative and wanting to try new things. Not saying that every student with dyslexia should have this list of things, but it's one of the things that you want to look for, especially when we talk about the dynamics and differences and discrepancies between your ability to read, but you can paint like nobody's business, or your inability to read, but you understand everything that I'm saying and can explain it to me really well back. And so those are some things that we need to keep in mind, that students with dyslexia have many strengths, and we should definitely honor those. All right, guys, that was my time. I thank you so very much again for having me. And I hope that this information was helpful to you all. And I always lead with, now that we know better, we've got to, and we're obligated to go out and do better. Thank you again.